You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from thecinematropolis.com. And today's topic is Livewire. So, Joshua, here's just my first take here. I am frankly shocked just by how relevant some of the messaging here is. I don't know if the messaging is clear, but it feels relevant. You're telling me that toxic AF talk show hosts on the radio can get people riled up and start like mobs? What is this? This is made in the 90s, but yet it feels like it was made today. What's going on?
I don't know what to say because I missed everything after shocked to discover. Honestly, Caleb. No, you're right. It feels really topical and interesting, which is why it's a little sad that the episode doesn't really come down on anything like an opinion or a point of view, which is actually not bad news. It's just an interesting choice considering some of the stuff that's brought up and then not put to bed in this episode.
Yeah, I guess, and we'll get into it, but that was my big takeaway. I was like, wow, this is, I mean, the first half of the episode, I was like, wow, man, this feels very topical. This feels very relevant. We're living in a early 2021 here. We've seen what happens when you have toxic radio show hosts, what kind of power they do and they have when they abuse their platform. I wonder what they're going to do with it. Oh, wait, they're not really going to do anything with it. It just is an observation.
So before we move into the designs of the actual episode, though, I do want to say you're on to something because superhero stories have had their finger on the pulse of the dangers of media, including extremely conservative talk show hosts. This has come up before. In the 80s, there was a big DC Universe line-wide crossover that had a lot of slow build-up to it that was kind of reintroducing Darkseid and Apocalypse and the Fourth World stuff after they had lain fallow for a little bit. And one of Darkseid's chief lieutenants is a guy named Glorious Godfrey. He's basically Darkseid's propaganda guy. And he came to Earth ahead of Darkseid's invasion in order to lay the pathway at the thoughts and feelings, the shock and awe, the hearts and minds level. And he was, get this, because this was the 80s and we were having to deal with a lot of G. Gordon Liddy. He was G. Gordon Godfrey.
Whoa! Now that is some pointed criticism there. I love that. That's fantastic. That is comic books having a cultural conversation with the zeitgeist in the real world at its finest.
And to be honest, they didn't let that die forever because we see hints of that. They don't go quite as hard for it, or at least they haven't yet, because, Young Justice, the new series that came out in the mid 2000s, I think, the 2010s, and then kind of went away for a good long time and is now back thanks to HBO Max and DC Universe. They introduced that version, or a version of that version of Glorious Godfrey, as a kind of Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson type in the show. And I don't think, so this is a little bit of a spoiler, friends, I don't think that they've yet revealed that he's tied to Darkseid. But trust me, if his name is Godfrey and he's on a television or on a radio, it's definitely Glorious Godfrey.
All right. Well, that is a good... Joshua, you're taking me to school here. I love that. I love that because maybe, and we'll get into this episode. Maybe this episode doesn't land on it, but that's the kind of conversation I like seeing comics have with real world events. Like, hey, what if we take this thing, talk show, propaganda type thing, and, show how it can be abused by giving it to the villains, in the comic books. And, not to draw too many real world parallels, but we've seen a lot of not great consequences of this unfold in the last couple of years. So obviously it is a powerful tool that could be exploited by any villain who's worth their salt.
Absolutely. And I think that taking this real world problem and then making it look largely the same, but then tying it to much bigger metaphorical problems that only superheroes can solve, i.e., a conservative radio talk show host who is fomenting hate and anger and distrust but he's doing it on behalf of a space god of evil.
Yes.
You know, like that's perfect. That's what superhero comics should do. Do not have Superman fight drug dealers. Superman can't beat drug dealers. You know, not really. You know, it's like make the metaphor work, you guys.
Yes, 100%. And, you know, I will just bring it back to Livewire. I don't know that they commit to the metaphor, but that it is something that they use that I find fascinating. And again, we've talked about on this show in various episodes about how there's this thing that's exploited by the villains that you're like, oh, wait, this was a problem in the 90s. Oh, hey, it's still a problem today.
Yeah.
So, and yes, I think it's another example.
And it's exacerbated. Being a person who really came into their teens and 20s in the 90s, I am really looking at how a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today were seeds planted then during times of, you know, relative peace and prosperity in comparison. And we've just let them grow until now they're huge, giant problems. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but you're absolutely right. I think that us seeing these things as low-key problems in Superman the Animated Series and New Batman Adventures, but now they're playing out in the real world in much bigger and more terrible ways. I don't think that's accidental. I mean, I think that's the trajectory of American history.
And Joshua, I just think the last word I want to like add on to that is just, it's almost like comic books are not prophetic, but like because they are able to live in a place where they are able to heighten like, you know, the like consequences and things that occur.
Yes.
It's why a lot of times when we have seen these sorts of things, i.e. toxic talk show hosts rallying people to do really terrible things in the real world, manifest in the real world, like they feel like over the top and out of a comic book, it's because comic books kind of already did them, because they were basically looking at the trends and saying, what if we amp this up? What would it look like? And turns out we didn't learn the lesson in time. So, you know.
Turns out it looks like now.
Yeah.
Whoops. Only unfortunately, no Superman is here to save us. Wow. And on that extremely depressing note, let's shift over to this. Wow. Here's Livewire. So, okay. To lighten the mood a little bit, let's talk about Leslie Willis a little bit before we get to Livewire. Okay. My feeling on Leslie is that her look is extremely obvious. You know, but it also is only used for maybe half the episode, and then I think we never see it again. So I'm like, okay, it's fine. We can be 80s punk by way of 90s goth. I don't care. Go with it.
Listen, Joshua, I feel like you grew up in this time, so you actually know better than me. But this, as I have seen in pop culture from this era of the 90s, this seems very par for the course for terms of like women's fashion for women who wanted to be like edgy, you know, like you said, goth. It was kind of like this is where like the sort of like goth fashion started to take off, right?
Yeah, yes, I would say so. I mean, and what we have here with Leslie is really kind of like lazy goth, you know, like lazy mall goth. It's not bad. It's just there's not a lot to it. And I think that's okay because we get the point of Leslie pretty quickly. And then this look disappears forever in favor of the, in my opinion, absolutely perfect look that is Livewire.
Yes, Livewire. A+ design. I love that they committed to it. I love everything about this particular design, and I think we should call out too, as we talk about the design, a Livewire. This is an original character, so they weren't basing this off of pre-existing comic book. At least I don't believe so. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, Joshua. But I like that it's committed to the electrical theme. I love the hair. I love the blue, and I just like how she's able to like shoot thunderbolts from her fingers. The whole gimmick works really well. Yeah.
Okay. I have a lot of feelings about this. So I'm going to take everything you said and go into much more detail because I just have a lot of feelings about how good Livewire is. And I want to take the time to really drill down on this because we have had some very lackluster episodes of both Superman and Batman of late. And some of that lack of luster is in the design. So when they get it right, by God, I want to talk about it. So, first of all, the all black outfit is amazing. It contrasts perfectly with her pale blue skin, and it gives us ties to her previous life, right? Like, it was an all black outfit before. She did not lose her entire aesthetic when she became Livewire. She didn't suddenly put on like a green and yellow outfit like Electro. She wears clothes that Leslie might have worn under the right situation, and I think that's great. Drilling down on the blue skin, I love it. She is utterly changed. She might be a little inhuman, just like her actions. And it also gives her, now this is me doing a little literary theory here, but I think you're going to like it. It gives her a really ghostly appearance to me, that pale blue. And now that she can enter electrical devices, she is like a ghost in the machine.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. That was the one thing I didn't mention there, Joshua, is I love, outside of being able to shoot like thunderbolts out of her fingers or whatever, I love how she's able to like we see her dive into one of those electronic LED billboards, like seamlessly and take control of it and manipulate it. I'm like, holy cow, she literally is pure energy. So yes, a ghost in a machine. I think that's a perfect analogy.
And we're going to see that used to more effect in other episodes with her. So I wanted to plant that seed because I don't know that they were doing that on purpose with that skin, but it just, like I say, with the black and everything, it's just very ghostly. And then I was like, oh, and she can go into the machine. And the last element of her overall look is the spiked hair. Now, it's very cartoonishly like the hair that a character would get if they put their finger in a light socket or something like that. But since it ties directly into her gimmick, and I think on her makes her appear frightening and not at all goofy. Like, I think when she's angry with that hair straight up, that Bride of Frankenstein, but more so, I just think it really works. I think Livewire is basically perfect as far as a design. So great job, Superman the Animated Series.
And like I said, I think the only other character we've called out being an original Superman the Animated Series character before this would have been Mercy Graves, which is another stellar design and character choice. Unfortunately, I think these are only two of the characters that end up making the transition back to comics. But I think the reason for that is both of them did a lot of things really, really well. Livewire, I think just conceptually, the character is at least fascinating. But both her powers and that design, like you point out, is so strong. I'm really glad to see it's stuck around to varying degrees.
Now, moving into the actual show itself, I want to point something out that really stood out to me in the credits that probably missed you entirely. And that is no shade. I am the one who brings the comic book nonsense to the table here. So this episode was written by Evan Dorkin and Sarah Dyer. Are you familiar with these names, Caleb?
I am not, Joshua. Please educate me.
Okay, I don't want to go down a huge rabbit trail with them because I really could. Evan Dorkin and Sarah Dyer are a married couple and also a writing partnership. And they were giants in the indie comics with an X and zine scenes of the 80s and 90s, okay? They are all over that stuff, and a lot of it is really excellent, and some of it was even like optioned into an animated series around 2002. That one is Welcome to Eltingville, so I would actually highly recommend Welcome to Eltingville if you can find it available somewhere. I honestly don't know, or the comics if you can find them, but you would also be looking for Dork Magazine and Milk and Cheese. There's a lot of satire and commentary on comic books and the industry and the tropes. And yeah, Dorkin and Dyer are really great writers broadly. And I want to say this as nicely as I can. I do feel like the writing in this episode is just okay. Like, just put a pin in that. We'll talk more about it. But I'm not sure how much we can hang that on Dorkin and Dyer because usually I find them really great. And I would highly recommend you taking a look at their work.
All right. That is a good note. I'm going to check them out. I would agree the writing in this episode is just okay. But I'm glad that you're calling that out. So I know, in fact, I'm going to Google them right now.
So that's the writing team. Wanted to point them out. More comic book history, nonsense, interesting tidbits. Getting into this episode, I feel like the central metaphor is shock jock turns into electricity villain. Wow. Obviously.
What a metaphor.
Yeah, a metaphor, you might say. And, okay, I really like this juxtaposition. I mean, I like when supervillains' real world names influence the kind of supervillain that they become. I really do. I really like that Kite Man is Charles Brown. I really like that the Riddler is Edward Enigma. Mr. Freeze is just changing the spelling of his name. I love that stuff. I think that's great. So I'm not complaining about that shift at all. However, in terms of this episode, it feels like either Dorkin and Dyer were handed this idea and just kind of did their best with it, or maybe they fell in love with that idea a little too much and didn't, develop it entirely. Because Leslie herself feels a little bit half-baked, no matter how extremely 90s a shock jock becoming a supervillain is.
Okay. So I have thoughts here. I'm gonna come back to this because I want you to lay it out, because I think we've already made it clear that we don't think this episode commits well enough to their entire theme. But I do think that you taking the shock jock turns shock villain, and you pair that with sort of the observations about the media.
Yes.
There's some stuff here. I want to dive into, but we'll come back to that. What anything else stick out to you about Livewire in particular?
Well, I guess I have some questions about Leslie, right? Like, the half-baked part of Leslie is that I don't understand what she's so mad about. Like, at one point they suggest that maybe she's just stirring things up for ratings, but then in her actual conversations with Lois, she seems to really hate Superman. Like, she really dislikes him. It doesn't seem to be an on-air act. And either one of these would make sense, but together it kind of confuses me. The only insight that we really get into this is when she talks about how it's so easy for Superman, whereas she, as a woman working in media, has had to work, twice as hard to be half as recognized. And the part that I find most confusing, and I'd really like to hear how you feel about this, is she says this to Lois Lane. And Lois Lane neither dissuades her of this, nor does Lois support it. And it feels like that's exactly the kind of thing that Lois Lane, of all people, would have an opinion about.
Yeah, most definitely. And here's what I find interesting about this. So this episode is making a lot of observations about the media, the larger institution, the larger institution. And I want to separate that from Lois, because Lois is journalism, which is a part of the media, but not the same. It's not the same thing. The media is much larger. It's television, it's radio. In 2021, it's the internet, it's social media, versus journalism, which is more like storytelling, reporting. So I think they actually have, and we see basically both of them as professionals have come up probably about the same time in their own platform. Lois Lane as a journalist at the Daily Planet, and then Leslie, who I can't remember the radio station, but basically this radio station she worked at has
W Lex, basically.
My gosh. How did I miss that? Oh, goodness. That's good. That's very appropriate, too. It's very appropriate. And that actually ties into one of the things I wanted to get into, is that Lex is the one who's bankrolling her.
Yeah. Sorry. Since you mentioned that, that's another option that could have been a motivator for Leslie, or at least an explanation of how she rose to the heights that she did. Like, if Lex just liked her because she hates Superman and therefore sort of artificially accelerated her. Except then, if that's what happened, I don't know that I love what that says about a woman fighting and clawing their way to the top of a usually male-dominated industry. It's just very muddled, I guess, as far as what we're saying and why Leslie is the one to say it. And I think it's worth saying. I want to do this before we go on, because you and I have a lot of feelings about this, but I want to say, we've had a real problem with the last couple of episodes of both Superman and New Batman Adventures. We really like this one. This is a really fun episode. I just find it a little confusing that they bring stuff up and then never really put it back down.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because they're making it's like halfway, half baked. It's halfway there, because a lot of some of these topics that they bring up related to the media really do remind me of just like some of the topics we saw in the original Batman the Animated Series about like revenge and justice, think Mr. Freeze and stuff.
Yes.
But they actually focus on one or two things and then deliver in the end a clear statement about like what's the audience takeaway versus this. Okay, so here's what I got, Joshua. I'm just going to dive right into it. I do want to, before I do though, I just want to mention, to put a pin in the Lois Leslie conversation, I think they are both professionals in the same industry working in parallel and in their own lanes. So there's a certain respect there that I imagine exists even if they don't like each other or agree with the other, because obviously Lois is writing generally positive pieces about Superman versus Leslie, who's trying to tear him down. Now, when I just think about like Leslie at one point, when she's Livewire, literally says, "I am the media," which I thought was very pointed and on the nose.
Yeah.
Okay, now, and here's the thing though, it's not just Leslie obviously manifesting the media as like the villain and the character, but also it's not just that. Outside of like her basically being Rush Limbaugh for Metropolis anti-Superman, there's also how she manipulates the media, or how the media manipulates the situation. So when we see Superman step out of the hospital, they're all like, "Why didn't you save her?" And he's like, "I did that my best." And they're like, "Did you really though?" You know what I mean? It was clearly designed to frame it up as, oh, these reporters, and this is where it gets kind of muddled. These reporters are out to get Superman, and we don't, like they're totally spinning it and like framing him negatively when we saw it work out really well. So that's something else I want to call out too, because as we've seen, the show also is very pro-journalism. And technically what they're doing could be considered journalism. It's just a different form of it. So it gets a little muddled. It's not very clear.
Well, and the other part of those reporters is that their questions are very fair. Not everybody got to follow Superman around on this adventure like we, the audience, did. Like, it's fair to ask. Remember, we're still relatively early in his career, and not this set of episodes, but soon we're going to have a really serious conversation about the world trusting Superman, and should they, right?
Right.
I mean, these guys are asking legitimate questions from their perspective, but that just muddies the waters for me further, because Leslie was also, as Livewire, clearly in public just blowing a bunch of stuff up. Anyway, it's muddled. So yes, I wanted to agree with you. Those reporters at the end are a really interesting thing that also just kind of fails to land entirely for me.
Right. Well, and here's the other thing too. I actually didn't realize the radio station she was recording or, doing her show from was owned by LexCorp, because at the end, there's two other observations I want to make. Just following this idea of this episode is about Superman's relationship with the media. The next one is that she was defeated by her own hand. So you notice like she blew the dam and the water washed over her. And how many times have you seen really toxic hosts like insert foot in mouth? Now, that usually doesn't mean the end of them. Usually they come up with a way to spin their way out of that stupid thing they just said or whatever. But all I'm saying is like, I think there is this sort of like really subtextual idea that, the media is bigger than Superman. It's pure energy. It's pure, especially the kind of media that Leslie ran in. It's pure anger and toxicity. And like Superman can't necessarily just punch toxicity in the face, but
right.
She is defeated by her own hand though. Her anger and just like I would say drive to defeat Superman. She blows the dam and the water like cools her off and she's subdued. So her pride and her arrogance is what essentially brings her down. So that's like the next thing I wanted to highlight. The last thing that I found interesting is going back to the LexCorp thing. The wealthy tycoon is the one who puts Leslie on life support in order to forward his own agenda. So even though it's one of those things like maybe he's not like, he didn't quote unquote create Livewire essentially, but he was bankrolling her as Leslie. And now that she's been through this, he's like, I think you might come in handy someday. So I'm just going to pay for to keep you on life support versus let you, fizzle out. So I just find that interesting too, that you have wealthy tycoons who are essentially bankrolling a lot of these toxic type talk show hosts, I guess. So I don't know. Again, that's not a clear statement. That is hardly textual. That's just me sort of reading into it a little bit. But I found it to be an interesting arc.
No, totally. I agree. And so my last kind of commentary on the weakness of this plot before we talk about the stuff that really works, because I think there's a lot that really works too. As you were describing those issues, it made me realize, like, I have a point in my notes where I say Livewire just starting to blow stuff up does not make as much sense as we would like. You know, like, it's a weird pull out of nowhere considering where she was as Leslie. Once we establish that she can go into devices and she can show herself on screens and stuff, doesn't it make more sense for that to be the reason she needs a bunch more power so that she can take over more airwaves just to talk about how terrible Superman is and maybe maneuver him into a place where he looks bad on camera? Like, that, just that shift, instead of spending time blowing stuff up and instead just taking over the airwaves, I feel would have done a lot to kind of sharpen whatever commentary this episode may have been trying to make.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. They could have followed through more strongly. And I'd also say this is another example of somewhat a parasite, like a small thinking villain with these incredible powers that don't really know how to utilize them to their max, you know? So I'm interested.
You're right, but I don't feel like Leslie should be that person. I feel like Leslie should at least get the big ideas in her specific area of expertise, you know? It's a good comparison with Parasite. I think you're on to where their heads were at. I just don't know. We only get, 12 minutes of Leslie, but it feels like there's a big break between Leslie and Livewire when there didn't have to be.
Oh, no, and I just want to reiterate, I agree. Like, I do think it's half-baked. A lot of this is me reading into what I think was going on, and there are little context clues, but it is certainly not executed, I think, as well as it could have been.
Yeah. And which is fine, because as far as the adventure side of this episode, I really, really like it. I really like it. I like a bunch of stuff that they do and don't really comment on quite a lot. There's many good things. For instance, a piece of this episode that reminded me of some other Superman media that is near and dear to your heart and far away and repulsive to mine is that Livewire gets her powers from massive amounts of voltage interacting with Kryptonian physiology. Okay? That is a great move, and I'm surprised that they don't revisit it a lot. It reminded me of a better version of Smallville's obsession with kryptonite.
Oh, you my ears perked up. You mentioned Smallville. Go on.
Well, no, it's just, most of the villains in Smallville were powered or changed or in some way messed up by kryptonite, right?
Yeah,
and that's an investment whose return falls off sharply and quickly. And I think you could get to the same place with using Superman's body as the reason people get superpowers all the time. But if you did it every now and then, I think that's really cool and really interesting superhero science, right? Like, Superman isn't from here. He is fundamentally different physiologically. He absorbs and redirects energy in ways that a human body simply cannot. And so the idea that massive amounts of energy might interact with his body and therefore interact with someone else's body feels like it could have been the Superman version of Wayne Enterprises accidentally created a supervillain, you know?
Yeah, no, most definitely. And it is a fun pull. I actually quite liked that. That was how she got her powers. And in fact, I mentioned, my Superman power level check-in this week was that Superman absorbed and then became a conductor for a bolt of lightning. As in, he got struck by lightning and was totally holding it together, and then was unwittingly passed it along to Leslie because she just happened to be nearby. Wow, Superman. I mean, there's a lot of things that he's withheld, but a straight, like, force of nature bolt of lightning seems pretty intense.
Yeah.
So very, very good, Superman.
And it drove him to his knees, but it didn't, like, take him out. And also the idea that he would accidentally create Livewire, because that's just how electricity works. And of course, he's going to put his indestructible body between danger and even this woman who clearly hates him. All that's like some really great character stuff for Superman. And Leslie playing with fire, or in this case, playing with electricity, and it burning her in a way is great. I mean, because let's not forget that when she gets her powers, it's not just powers, that she is fundamentally changed. Like, she is no longer entirely human anymore because she can change herself into pure electricity and back. Like, that's not just I got some powers. That's like a fundamental shift. She's barely human in my estimation. She's really other now.
Yes, most definitely. And again, I think it just sort of she's her own worst enemy. She's got all this anger, but she really wasn't benefiting anybody by holding this whole thing together. And in fact, Superman did save her life, but it's only because she put herself in that position that she became Livewire in the first place. You know, this was all very self-destructive behaviors. And for what? For fame, question mark? I don't know. I don't know why they couldn't just reschedule it. I guess those contracts are pretty expensive.
Well, I think it's really interesting also that if Superman were actually the person she said he was, she would just be dead because he wouldn't have been there to save her.
Oh, 100%. And what that reminds me, one thing I wanted to note that I didn't mention when looking at the media piece, I actually think this opening montage at the beginning, where it's sort of a really interesting juxtaposition. We have Leslie on talk radio describing Superman as this awful, awful person who's going around and abusing his power, cross-cut with Superman actually saving people. So it's just like one of those things where it's like, oh, she's just blatantly lying. You know, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just saying stuff because if you're actually watching what he's doing what he's all about, you know? And again, if he was who she accused him of being in that opening montage, yeah, he would have said, go ahead, get struck by lightning. Why do I care?
Right. Absolutely. And it's just, that juxtaposition of her saying awful things about Superman that are ironically the opposite of what he's doing. We've seen that happen more than once on BTAS and New Batman Adventures. It's nice to see that. I don't know, is that a rhetorical trick since there's visual also? But you get what I'm saying. I like that kind of motif being pulled over to this show as well. I think it really works here.
Yes. Yeah, most definitely.
Plot-wise, things that I like very much in this episode that I think should be applied to modern superhero fiction more broadly. So, Livewire gets her powers. She spends about a minute accidentally messing stuff up, and then she instinctively starts to understand and use them. And I like this for two reasons. First of all, we move our superhero plot along at a good clip, right? We do not pause while everybody figures out their powers, Snoresville. We get right to the point. Additionally, I really like that angle because it goes to my point that she's now fundamentally other than human, right? She is as much electricity as she is woman. And so she instinctively understands how to use that once she kind of gets her wits about her. I really like that maneuver a lot.
Right. Because, when you think about it, too, I mean, yes, these are crazy powers that she just has, but like it seems like they seem very intuitive, you know, like, hey, you can just shoot bolts from just point over here, or you just jump into stuff like you're swimming. I don't know. Yeah, it does keep it moving along really well. And I also think, too, given the fact that this power is like high energy, it makes sense that she would try to, you know, she'd be really like, it's almost like being jacked up on caffeine or Coke or something. Like she's like, I gotta try all this stuff, you know? So I thought that was a nice touch as well.
And to that end, I really appreciate the introduction of her costume very quickly. And in an extremely super science-y nonsense kind of way. Like it's a borderline a magical girl transformation for a villain. And since I love the outfit so much, I love this also. It's so good.
Oh, yeah. What was her justification? She's like, I ionized the particles around my body or something nonsensical like that. Yeah, that was great.
It.
That's comic book shenanigans at their finest as well.
Right, and it's comic book shenanigans not used to spackle over bad plot. It's super science shenanigans meant to move this thing along. At the end of the day, there is a strength and a weakness for this episode, and they are the same thing. And the strength and the weakness of this episode is we want to get to the place where a woman made of electricity in a flashy outfit is fighting Superman. And by God, they get there really quickly. And like I say, it's both a strength and a weakness because we do feel like this episode could say a little more if it wanted to. And it maybe instead is a little too focused. And I can't believe I'm the one who's saying this, but it's a little too focused on getting us to a woman made of electricity fighting Superman.
Right. Well, Joshua, I just had one more note, and that's just that, hey, I had no idea that Metropolis had a Las Vegas strip in it. This is news to me. I mean, it makes sense, but is this comic book thing, or is this just, because it's convenient?
I think that this is one of those examples of the city of Metropolis having whatever they need to make the point that they want to make in that scene. We've seen this with Gotham also. All of a sudden, there's a Statue of Liberty style Statue of Justice in the Bay because we want a Zeppelin to run into it or something. We're actually going to see a really egregious example of that in our next episode on New Batman Adventures, where it's like, wait, what? Where are we? Is Gotham in Arizona? So I think Metropolis just has whatever Metropolis needs to make the coolest scene, which is fine with me. Like, I don't have a problem at all with, maybe it would have made more sense to go with kind of more of a Times Square approach for Metropolis, but whatever. Have a strip. Just have some electricity that Leslie can mess up. I'm cool with it. On that note, I want to point out how smart the move to the hydroelectric dam is, okay? Both, it makes sense both as a character move and a plot move. We have established this dam in previous episodes. We've seen it. It's been in other scenes. We've had other action scenes. It's been in the background. We've had other scenes at this dam. This has existed in the Superman continuity before now. And although it makes a certain amount of 8th grade science sense that water would short Livewire out, Leslie doesn't think science thoughts, right? And Superman thinks some science thoughts, but not that far, right? It doesn't occur to him that would work. And the thing that I love about this is, because the hydroelectric dam already exists, it makes sense for her to go to it. And because she's the type of person that she is, it makes sense that Leslie would not realize water was her weakness yet. But at the same time, water shorting out electric villains is very traditional. And like you say, it comes around to where she's brought low by her own hand, which is always poetic and delicious. And I love it. So I just want to say, great work on the big action set piece at the end of this episode.
Listen, Joshua, anytime you can add a hydroelectric dam into an episode, I'm there. We've only seen good things happen when we go to the hydroelectric dam in Superman the Animated Series, so I'm all about it.
All right, Caleb, I think that's about all we have to say about Livewire. So let's chat about what other things our listeners should be watching, reading, or experiencing if they enjoyed this episode of Superman the Animated Series.
Right. So I struggle with this one a little bit, but here's what I landed on. I want to recommend one of my very favorite movies of 2020. It is called The Vast of Night, and it is about a radio DJ who is sort of reporting on weird happenings that may or may not be related to aliens in their small 1950s Americana town. And it is an excellent film, very sharp writing, directed by Andrew Patterson and also co-written by Craig Sanger, who is a friend of mine. So a little bias here, but tremendous film. It's a loose tie because in The Vast of Night, the radio DJ is not a toxic piece of isn't trying to fester toxicity, but rather trying to report on strange occurrences. But I thought it was a good recommendation. And then I also just wanted to recommend a positive example of the media in action, or I guess, again, going back to what I said earlier, it's more journalism oriented, but All the President's Men, whenever people who are committed to the truth fight for it, they fight against the oppressive forces that could be the government, that could be corporations, but they commit to it because it's the right thing to do, even though there's a lot of risks involved. And by the way, when you do this in the media, it's really hard to do because there's a lot of legal risk whenever you're going up against the big dogs. So All the President's Men, it's an American classic film, Dustin Hoffman, you got to check it out. It's great. It's great. So Vast of Night on Amazon Prime right now. There's an Amazon Prime original, and then All the President's Men. Joshua, what would you recommend listeners watch, read, or play?
Some days you just give up on a deeper meaning and you go for over-the-top media personalities doing ridiculous stuff with only the barest hint of characterization. And with that in mind, I recommend Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy.
Good one.
Now, I admit, I am a man who definitely gets his fill of Will Ferrell pretty quickly, but this movie just works for me. Maybe it's the ensemble cast. Maybe it's the fact that Christina Applegate is, just as competent and funny and together as Will Ferrell, and her character is a really solid, serious counterpart to Ron Burgundy's madness. For whatever reason, sort of against all odds with my personal preferences, that movie really works for me, and I think it has more in common with Livewire than you might initially think.
Oh, 100%. Especially if you watch the sequel, which only amplifies some of the same stuff. Okay.
It's true. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We publish in-depth essays of all different types of films. We also have a podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, that is currently in an ongoing special series about 3 films that got people through the pandemic. Check it out there. You can find all those articles over at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about the new Batman Adventures episode, The Ultimate Thrill.
Until next time, look! Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an animated discussion!